Good evening. I'm so proud of John for writing this book. You know, I've known John since we were kids back in Woodstock, back in the old days, and I can't believe he finally wrote a book. I started a novel once, and those things take forever to read, you know. That's a joke. That's a Fred Willard joke. So, I don't know. I think there's been a big shift in the last few years in the public consciousness, the realization that we've been invaded by a pernicious group of surveillance capitalists is beginning to penetrate the zeitgeist. And I think John has written the definitive treatise on this event and how we can counteract it. So with that, would you please welcome John Taplin?
So, T-Bone and I have been talking about this for a few years. We came here to Nashville during the Americana Music Convention last year. And so he's been a part of this idea that maybe artists are getting screwed by the big internet monopolies. So I'm going to just start and just show you a couple of slides from my new book. And then Craig and I are going to have a conversation about this, and then we're going to also talk about the last waltz and some history. So my history goes back to the time when I graduated from Princeton. I went to work for this group called The Band, and that's a picture that Richard Avedon took of me and the band in 1969. And the guy in the back is a guy named Levon Helm, who was the drummer. And the band made some fabulous music, some of which you will hear tonight, in the 60s and 70s. And because that music was so good, they continued to make a living off it into the 80s and 90s, because, as you all know, the CD came out in the late 80s, and everybody renewed their collection, and so there was a whole new royalty stream for people to make a living. And then in 2000, Levon got throat cancer, and he couldn't work anymore. And literally the same moment that he got throat cancer, another cancer arrived, which was called Napster. And that meant that anybody could get that old music for free. And the royalty stream that he had relied on, that was making him $100,000 a year in 1999, just came to a halt. And he couldn't even pay for his health insurance. And so a bunch of friends, Larry Campbell and others, kind of rallied around him, and they began to put on house shows at his barn, which were called the Midnight Rambles. And so he was able to make enough money to pay for his health care. But then he died, and the whole thing to me seemed incredibly unfair. So I began to try and think about how this all happened. And so I'm just going to give you a little history. So the internet was created in the late 60s by a bunch of hippies, countercultural guys. I mean, that's a picture of Stuart Brand, who had the Whole Earth catalog and created the Whole Earth Electronic Link, which was one of the first networks. And that was him with Ken Kesey. And, they put on the acid tests in San Francisco at that same time. And that little drawing is the first idea of the internet, which was called ARPANET at that time, because it was financed by the US government. It was actually financed by the Defense Department. And the whole idea, as Nick Negroponte said, was to decentralize control and harmonize people. And that's because those of us who are old enough, and I see some gray hair out there, remember that in 1968, in any given town, there were 3 television networks and 1 newspaper. So it made sense that maybe there should be a more democratic medium of media. But then in the late 80s, some people came out of Stanford University, led by this guy, Peter Thiel, who were trained on Ayn Rand. into extreme libertarian thinking. And the whole idea was, as Thiel said, I no longer believe that capitalism and democracy are compatible, because he thought that democracy got in the way of the capitalists making money, so that somehow we had to create a new kind of business structure that had no regulation, in which democracy could not regulate the capitalists. And he created a company called PayPal, and out of PayPal came what he proudly called the PayPal Mafia, and you notice they're all men. And they ended up running most of Silicon Valley, YouTube, Uber, all these companies. And these people were libertarian and extreme. You'll see up there on the left-hand corner what's known as a seastead. And the idea was that you would create these companies in these cities that were outside the control of any government. And Thiel is actually building one of those right now. So Thiel said that the internet would come to rule American democracy. And in 1987, that sounded like a pretty weird thing, but it actually turned out to be true. So on the left is the largest companies in the world 10 years ago. So that would be ExxonMobil and Citibank and General Electric. And on the right are the largest companies today. That's Apple, Google, Amazon, Facebook, and Microsoft. And by the way, Facebook just moved up ahead of ExxonMobil on that right-hand chart. So these companies are now the largest companies in the world. And they globally dominate all their businesses. So there's Facebook up there on that one chart, and there's all the other social networks down in the corner. There's Google with 88% market share, and Bing and the others are down there around 4%. And then there's Amazon, 75% of the book business. And last year, 85 cents of every new dollar spent online went to either Google or Facebook. So those are what we call monopolies. And what did it do to the music business and the journalism business? So the left-hand chart is the revenues for newspaper advertising since Google went online, fell by 76%. And on the right chart is the revenues for the music business since these companies, since Napster, and that fell by 72%. So this is deep destruction, and it affects every single artist in the world. Just two more charts. So it isn't that these companies, that people stop listening to music or watching movies or reading the newspaper. It's just that all the revenue was reallocated from the people who made content, like the people who live in this town, to the people who own these monopoly platforms that make their money through advertising. Peter Thiel said, competition is for losers. If you want to build and sustain value, you have to build a monopoly. And these companies did. And they used their monopoly power to exercise power, and Thiel was probably right when he said Google had more power under Obama than Exxon had under Bush. So just two things for you to think about. It's probably not aware, but that YouTube has almost 60% of the streaming audio market. You think that YouTube is a video service, but more than half the content on YouTube is just audio files with a picture at the beginning. So every tune in the world is there for free, and yet they contribute less than 11 or 12% of the music money to the music. So if I had a tune that was incredibly successful, that could sell 1 million downloads on iTunes, myself or my record company would make $900,000. And if I had 1 million streams on YouTube, I would make $900. And that's the problem. So Craig's going to come out, and we're going to kind of talk about this issue and how it affects the people who make music in this town, and also how it affects the society in a deeper way, because we all know that fake news would not exist without these platforms. We all know that people sometimes use them to show off killing people, and we have to think about this. Okay, so thanks. Craig.
Good evening, everybody. What a nice scene. This is great. I'm Craig HAVIGHURST with WMOT Roots Radio, and it's a great pleasure to be here with Jonathan. Here's the book. You may have seen it coming in. This is my already well-worn and dog-eared advanced copy, and what a great read. There's been a number of books that have tackled this. I don't think there's been one that's that I've read that's as readable and that's as driven by personal experience and being in Silicon Valley and near it and working with it through your work with Annenberg. And then prior to that, having been worked with creators, worked with songwriters, worked with musicians, seen what it's like to be on the road, know how demanding it can be. And of course, as you alluded, just touched on the story of Levon Helm and the incredible injustice of somebody having to go out and beat the bushes to raise money at the end of his life to deal with cancer when it would have seemed, conventional wisdom would have said he'd had a revenue stream for the rest of his life. One quote that I would love to start with was words to this effect anyway, that you said at some point in the book, I mistook what I thought was a culture war was ultimately an economic war. What did you mean by that?
Well, you know, here's the problem that we've got to kind of come to grips with right now. We have allowed the technology business to kind of assume that it had the way to lead the society. And we've made, you know, kind of genius portraits of people like Mark Zuckerberg or Larry Page, or people like that, and maybe Steve Jobs was the leader of that. And so we kind of assumed that they knew how the society should run and how the world should be led. And I call it techno-determinism. But really what happened is that because there was no regulation on these companies, they were able to amass such fortunes to such a level that they are essentially controlling a lot of the way the world works right now. And the simplest example is that when people try and go up against these monopolies, for instance, an issue that is probably very important to this city. The reason Facebook or YouTube can post anything without permission is that they have what's known as a safe harbor law embedded in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. That means that no musician in this town can sue YouTube for putting up their content even without their permission. That also means that YouTube can carry 44,000 ISIS videos, which people use to train lone wolves. So that seems to me to be a crazy law. But when a series of hearings, which some of you in this town came to, that were led by the Registrar of Copyrights at the Library of Congress, when these series of hearings were had, and she eventually came to the conclusion that that law should be changed, 3 days later, she got fired because Google wanted her out of that position. And a organization like the Wall Street Journal wrote an editorial and said, this is outrageous use of monopoly power. And that's really what I meant by it's an economic war, not a culture war.
Did you did anybody see the effect that a Facebook would have? When it came on, it was competing with several other social networks. It took a few years for it to become the dominant social network. Even when it did become kind of the market leader, it was hard to imagine 5 or 6 years hence the impact it could have on culture. So you might not have thought this needs regulating. Only now that we kind of realize that fake news can spread from Estonia through channels to a social network where the most of the country's on, and their trusted friends are sharing things that the likes of us go, don't read that. What happened? Where was the tipping point that we missed?
Peter Thiel, who was the first investor in Facebook, had this idea that internet businesses were winner-take-all businesses. And this flows from a concept called the network effect, or Metcalfe's law, which is that a network is valued at a square times the number of users. So what it means is that in every given sector, there's going to be one business that's going to win. So clearly, Google won in search and search advertising. And the bet was that there would be one business that would win in social networks. And that was Facebook. But let's be clear that none of these businesses were built organically. They all were built because they were able to acquire other companies. So Facebook bought Instagram, Facebook bought WhatsApp, Google bought AdMob, Google bought DoubleClick, Amazon bought Twitch, bought Zappos, bought Alexa. And so the problem was that the antitrust authorities, which used to say, well, maybe you shouldn't be able to buy that, basically went asleep in 1980 and haven't woken up since. So nobody has ever said, well, this doesn't make sense for Facebook, which has 1,600,000 users, to buy WhatsApp, which had 400 million users, that this would get to the point. And, I was at an antitrust conference, and as T-Bone says, look, the tide is turning a little bit. But I was at a conference 2 weeks ago at the University of Chicago, which is, some of you who know about economics know, that's the home of Milton Friedman and the really conservative economic school. And essentially, the European Competition Commissioner said, Facebook told us that they could never integrate WhatsApp with the back end of Facebook, and they would remain as two totally separate businesses. And so after we approved it, we learned that they had already integrated the back end, and they knew exactly what they were doing, and they just flat out lied to us. Now it's probably too late to make them shed it, but we have to think about these issues. And what was so fascinating about this conference was that even the economists who were the most conservative came to the conclusion that this notion of surveillance capitalism, because that's what these businesses are, they don't care a bit about music or movies or anything. What they want is your data. And they want to lure you to give as much data to them as possible. So if I want to advertise only to women in Nashville who drive Dodge trucks and drink bourbon, I can do that on Facebook. I can get that granular. So how are they doing this? Well, not only are they using this device, and now last week the Trump administration gave them permission to get even deeper into, you have no privacy on that. But now they're putting these smart speakers in your home. You've seen these advertisements for Alexa or the Google Home. And those aren't smart speakers, they're smart microphones. And those microphones are always on. There was a case in Mississippi a couple of months ago where there was a domestic violence incident in a home where there was one of these Alexas on. And the district attorney subpoenaed, Amazon and said, we want the logs for this thing. And Amazon said, oh, you can't have it. It's First Amendment. And eventually he forced them to give it up. And of course, the whole incident had been recorded by the Alexa smart speaker. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I think we have to ask ourselves some big questions about just how much of our life do we want to surrender to these three companies.
Right. So I've been a media creator through these years of digital explosion, and I have taken advantage of it and been excited by it and seen incredible rewards and a multiplier effect of my ability. If I didn't get a major publication to pick up something, I could put it on Medium. If I made a short film for a record company with an artist, I could put it on YouTube, and this was something never before possible and truly extraordinary. And so for the likes of me, I was like, it's all good. Am I the frog in the slowly warming water who now has suddenly realized, whoa, I wasn't paying attention to the downsides? Or are you arguing that had the internet remained more decentralized and more democratic as the initial vision went, that I would have still had all those tools more and better?
I don't think that, I'm not arguing that any of these tools should go away. I'm just saying that if T-Bone decides that he doesn't want his music on YouTube for free, that should be his right. He should be able to enforce that. And so, and somewhere between paying $900 for 1 million streams and getting $900,000 for 1 million downloads, there is a fair price. And so all I'm asking is these companies, which, as I pointed out, are the richest companies in the world and are making net margins of 30%. I mean, those of you in this audience who are in business know that a net margin of 30% is pretty rich, that they should be sharing some of that money with the people whose content is what lures them. I mean, as T-Bone long ago pointed out, when you look at the percentage of Google searches that is for entertainment, it's almost 45% of all Google searches are for entertainment products. So, I mean, we know why people want to go search, but we should compensate the people whose content is the lure, because we also know that all these companies want is your data so they can sell it back to advertisers or sell you new products.
All right. And you started, you mentioned in the book that you were part of an early streaming video service and saw what was possible and were sort of ahead of your time. Did you guys talk about the implications of letting citizens upload their own stuff? I mean, that was the premise of YouTube, is regular people can put up their home movies and things that they've made themselves, and what harm could there be? But did you begin to contemplate, well, people will start to upload copyrighted material. What will we do at that point? We've invented this platform, and you said that there's no rationale to the safe harbor, but there is some rationale in the sense that if you've built this clever platform that lets everybody upload, the platform, if they're liable, suddenly they have to change the whole game. Everybody has to fill out a form before you upload. Or what did you all contemplate might happen in the user-generated content business?
Well, I was naive enough to start a streaming online video service in 1996. So that was pretty crazy, right? Broadband didn't come as fast as we thought it would. But putting that aside, our business was built on licensing content from creative people. So we paid Warner Brothers, we paid Universal, we paid all these companies money to get their content.
You thought there could be like Blockbuster video in the home and choose off the menu of...
That was the rationale, that people didn't want to go to the store on a Friday night and find out that what they wanted was already gone. And so that's what made sense. But the defense that YouTube makes or Facebook makes, especially in the last week, well, we can't block people from uploading content, is totally fallacious. You notice that there is no pornography on YouTube. Well, why is that? That's because they have very sophisticated artificial intelligence that when people are uploading things to the platform, if it sees a bare breast, it pushes it into a separate queue, and then a human looks at it and says, well, this is from National Geographic and we should let that up, but this is porn and it's not going to go up. So that same artificial intelligence could stop beheading videos, could stop videos of people killing people, and it also could stop songs that people don't want on the internet, because we all have used Shazam and know that in 3 seconds, the computer can identify any song in the world. And if an artist has said, I don't want that there, then it just never gets up there in the first place, instead of this ridiculous game of whack-a-mole that Nashville record companies spend $3 to $10 million a year just trying to chase these things down and file these, takedown notices, and it's absurd. It's like whack-a-mole.
Right. I wanted to dwell on a period, this critical period in the early 2000s when Napster came along. It was in the news. It was prominent. The recording industry and the movie industry, sort of down the line, was deeply alarmed for good reasons. But I was struck by two things that I thought were mistakes at the time. One was a real focus and attention on the downloaders. They constantly talked about all these kids who are downloading music for free. And there was much less emphasis on the uploaders, who tended to be a much smaller group who were putting lots of files. And I always thought it'd be easier to find those people, and it would be easier to explain to the public why what they're doing is wrong. And at the same time, newspapers and magazines began to let their content be free for years and set an expectation. So from the consumer's point of view and the user's point of view, those early 2000s were a time when expectations were set, and I thought the industries had the wrong priorities. What would you say about that?
Well, I'm not trying to argue that the executives that ran newspapers or ran the music business were that smart about what was coming. It's interesting, last night I was in New York with Jeffrey Toobin, who's a writer for The New Yorker, and we had a big meeting like this. And he pointed out that both the Wall Street Journal and The New Yorker, which obviously have a fairly niche audience, but it's a big audience, never allowed their content to be online for free. In other words, if you wanted the Wall Street Journal online, you had to pay from the get-go. And the same with the New Yorker. And those businesses did very well, because not only could they get subscription revenue, but they also could sell advertising. And quite frankly, the advertisers were happier to be on those platforms because they knew that it was a well-paying clientele and it was a good atmosphere to be in. So it's not as if now the New York Times and the Washington Post are trying to claw their way back to that world, and I think they're getting more and more successful. Yep. So in the end, I believe that these subscription platforms will be the way that everybody gets their content. But as far as the music business is concerned, we cannot have a viable subscription platform like, for instance, Spotify, unless you get rid of the free music on YouTube. Because Spotify made a business plan that it presented to every record company here in Nashville and said that by 2017, 80% of its customers would be on the subscription platform, and only 20% would be on the free with advertising. And it turns out it's just the opposite.
Oh, right.
Because who can compete with free? If a kid says, well, why should I pay $10 a month for this when I can get it all for free on YouTube? So, you know, you always have to get rid of that free tier if you're going to make this business run well.
Yeah. Folks, we're going to talk about another 10 minutes here, and then we'll have 10 minutes of audience questions, and Tom Truitt, I think, is running around with a microphone. But just a few more questions, if I may. What do you make of the fact that some of the most angry opponents of the copy left, the so-called copy left, a lot of people who we would associate with that early internet, the hippies, are sort of the ones now who are arguing that information wants to be free. You clearly are not of that ilk. What's happening out there in this dynamic?
Well, information doesn't want anything. You know, information is not, it has no affect whatsoever. What essentially the people, and a lot of them are academics who are on the copy left, is these are people who never got paid for anything in their life anyway, so they think nobody should get paid. You know, I mean, these are look, I worked for 14 years at University of Southern California. These are professors who would like everything for free because they've never made any money on their books, so why should anybody else get to make money? So it's a kind of stupid idea, you know, and not to put down the academic world, but, you know, that's not their, they don't have any concern for people who make their living writing, because they make their living getting paid by a university. And writing is just something to help them get farther up the stack and get paid more by the university. And they never make any money off their writing. So I don't put much stack in this copy left people.
Do you think that the campaigns that have gone on, sometimes with greater or less frequency, to explain to a younger generation that art has a cost and that violating copyright is a thing, is that catching at all? Has it worked?
Well, look, let's be very clear that the copy left, for want of a better word, is driven by Google and Facebook. You know, if you go on Google, strangely enough, just put in the word Google shill list, S-H-I-L-L, and you'll see a group of people who are paid to be shills for Google. And they're mostly academic or nonprofit organizations which are funded, like Public Knowledge, that are funded totally by Google to keep people from having to pay for content. Because how could Google make 30% net profit? I mean, Google is in the advertising business. The CBS is in the advertising business. CBS net profit margin is 11%, and Google's is 30%. What's the difference? CBS pays a lot of money for content, and Google doesn't pay anything for content. They're both in the advertising business. I mean, Google is 10 times as much revenue as CBS, but it's just so simple.
Going to shift to questions about The Last Waltz in a minute, but I really want to know what, you didn't dwell on crowdfunding in this book, which has been an avenue for artists who can test the market, who can have, you know, there's some really amazing things happening with it. What's your take on it? Is it part of this ecosystem in a way that is gratifying and uses the internet to the best of its potential?
Well, look, I think there's a role for the nonprofit. I mean, last night we were talking a lot about, you know, journalism has been so destroyed that only through something like ProPublica, where, you know, whether it's foundations or other things are funding nonprofit journalism, could maybe investigative reporting take place now? Because, you know, the average newspaper in Nashville can't afford an investigative reporting team. So maybe there is a role for that, and maybe that's an analog to, you know, crowdfunding. But on the other hand, most artists don't want a begging bowl. They want to just get paid. And, you know, when I had this argument with Alexis Ohanian of Reddit, and he said, well, if the band is in such a bad place, why don't I start a Kickstarter campaign for them? And I said, they don't want your charity. They don't want you to just take their music for free. You know, so, I mean, look, there's a role for crowdfunding, but I don't think that's the solution to the major problem that we're trying to deal with here.
All right. So, we're about to watch this remarkable movie. Just describe the situation that allowed The Last Waltz to get made, and what was the cinematic approach? Martin Scorsese, you work with him. It's a long, big story, but take us to that point where the green light was given and the approach that wanted to be how to capture this event.
So this movie came about literally over like a 2-week period. Robbie decided that the band was going to do this final concert. And then Robbie Robertson decided that he wanted to try and see if we could capture it in a documentary film. And I had worked with Marty Scorsese making a movie called Mean Streets, and he was in the midst of making a movie called New York, New York. And I said to Robbie, well, why don't we try and get Marty to do it? Now, Marty was under exclusive contract at United Artists to make New York, New York. But when I broached the idea to him, he said, I have to do this. This is so important. Because I knew he was a huge fan of the band. So we secretly met at night after we'd finished shooting New York, New York. And the concert was planned over the Thanksgiving weekend, which in Hollywood is a 4-day weekend. They give people Monday off, too. And so we had this window to do it. And so we got all the great cinematographers, Michael Chapman, Laszlo Kovacs, Vilmos Zsigmond, Hiro Narita. I mean, we got 6 great cinematographers. And insanely, we decided to make it on 35 millimeter film. So that means that the magazine load for 35 millimeter film is 10 minutes. So you've got this concert that's going on. You have 6 cameras all over. And Marty had literally drawn out every song where each camera should be at every point to capture each solo and all of that. But needless to say, you were going to run out of film, and the changing of a magazine takes at least 1.5 to 2 minutes if you're really fast. Okay. And so you had to kind of map it out, like some songs were not going to be made, some songs were going to be made. And then Robbie set about calling his friends. And Neil Young, and then Eric Clapton, and then Ringo Starr, and then Joni Mitchell, and then Ronnie Hawkins, then Muddy Waters, and you know, Van Morrison, and all these people that we had played with over the years, every single one of them said, I want to be there. And so then it just came together, and then Bob Dylan said, okay, I'll be there. And then, you know, we had to figure out how to make it all happen. But it literally, the concert happened on one night, and that was it. And that was the best part. And then the rest is interviews and other things that took place later.
What was your job exactly?
To do the physical production of getting everybody there and getting the camera platforms and do all the stuff and organizing all of that, just like you do in any production. You know, I was the executive producer, and that was my role, was to make sure that it came off. And it did. I mean, it came off with some glitches, which are fun. You're going to see tonight a sequence of Muddy Waters singing maybe his most famous song, which is called I'm a Man. And we had done a lot of kind of sound checks and rehearsals, but Muddy came very late. And so Marty didn't have a chance to do any rehearsal or planning for Muddy Waters' sequence. And so all he had was, Muddy is going to do 2 songs. One was Caledonia, and one was Mannish Boy. So Marty didn't know that Mannish Boy was I'm a Man, so he said, well, we'll do a magazine change during this song, Mannish Boy. And so every cinematographer had headphones on that Marty could tell him where to move and everything. And Laszlo Kovacs had the position stage right. And he got so sick of hearing Marty talk into the headphones that he took them off. And when Marty said, okay, time to change magazines, Laszlo kept shooting, right? Because he didn't hear anything. And then, of course, the first bars of this song, ba-bum, ba-bum, and Marty just goes, oh my God, this is the most famous Muddy Waters song, and nobody is shooting. But Laszlo Kovacs was shooting. And you will see that for the first 2 minutes and 50 seconds of the song, there's only one camera angle. And it's this one guy going in and out. And fortunately, Vilmos Zsigmond, who had the long shot, got his camera reloaded literally about 4 seconds before Laszlo's camera ran out of film.
Wow.
And so you have the whole song, but it only has 2 camera angles. It was one of those perfect miracles.
Nice, nice. We're going to go to audience questions here. Tom's got the
Maybe
microphone,
we
but I have
bring up the lights just a little bit.
I'm in the middle of the room, folks, over here by the soundboard. Anyone wants to ask a question, please come over here and queue up. We've got one right here in front of me that's eager to ask a
Somebody
question.
right here.
Yes, I'm eager. Thank you, Tom. Craig, Jonathan, thank you for being here. My name is Dan Keene. I love that you're putting that your book and your focus puts the onus on the folks making the most money to pay their fair share to the creators of the content. That's obviously spot on. But I disagree with you when you say that we need to get rid of free in terms of the subscription services, that free is the problem, because that then places the burden on the consumer, saying, consumer, you're supposed to pay, you shouldn't get this for free. Here's why I think that's a problem. Terrestrial radio has worked for decades for the writers and publishers. It's been free to consumers. You know, they turn it on in their car, they get their ads. It's worked for a long time. We need to add to this, though, a payment for the record labels and artists. And now the label people probably aren't going to clap anymore for me. But anyway, my point is that I don't think free to the consumer is the problem. I think that the folks making the money off of it from ads and other things that aren't paying their fair share, that's the problem. Thank you.
Look, I agree with you. A lot of media has always existed by advertisers supporting. But the question is, as I pointed out, you know, the Columbia Broadcasting System or the National Broadcasting Company made their money from advertising. But they spent a huge amount of that money that they made on making programming and made a lot of people very rich making that program. So you're totally right. It's not necessarily whether the consumer has to pay for every song, although I do think this subscription service idea is a useful way. But the main point is that if companies like YouTube or Facebook are making millions and millions of dollars off of advertising, they have to put more of it back towards the content and the artists. Could we turn up the lights a little bit so we can see what's going on out there in the hall?
In the interest of time, I'll keep talking. Here they go. John, my name's Andrew Kentz, and I'm a music banker. I bank the music industry. And my main question is your take on the probability of change. So what do you believe what do you believe is the probability in the next 5 years that these monopolists will actually change and will actually pay creators? And it's in all of our best interests that that's a high number, but I'm a little concerned about your answer.
Well, look, there's only 2 or 3 solutions. I mean, one is maybe the one I suggested, which is get rid of the safe harbor. But the other solution is potentially that we may have to take very strong antitrust actions towards these companies. And that might start by saying, well, they can't buy any more companies, like Google can't buy Spotify or things like that. You know, I would argue quite honestly that the problem of antitrust and of monopoly is spreading throughout the whole society. I would argue that United Airlines can treat their customers so badly because if you want to fly from Midland to Lexington, Kentucky, you only have one choice, so of course they can treat you like crap, you know? I mean, really. So, I mean, this is a problem in places beyond the entertainment business. But at the end of the day, the monopoly that Google and Facebook and Amazon represent are far higher than anything you can imagine. I mean, at least in the airline business, there are 4 airlines. In the search advertising business, there's only one player. And so you have no choice but to go with that one player. And so when you get to that position, you know, I ask myself, is there a market solution to this? And just think about this. If I came to you and said, I want you to give me $1 million because I'm going to go compete with Google and make a startup in the search engine business, you'd say, are you out of your mind? Nobody would do that. And the economists that I talk to say, look, if you have a business that has 30% net margins in a rational economic place, that should attract huge amounts of new money flowing into that business. But it's not happening. So the market is not working. And so at that place, maybe there's no possible opportunity except to maybe treat them like what economists call a natural monopoly. And what a natural monopoly is says that one firm can provide a service cheaper than 2 firms could. And in the 1950s, the Bell telephone system was a natural monopoly. And what was our solution to that? We said to them, okay, you can be a natural monopoly, but your research and development arm, which was called Bell Labs, has to license every one of their patents to any American company for free. So what happened? So Bell Labs, as probably some of you know, invented the transistor, the microprocessor, the laser, the cellular system, the satellite, pretty much everything that exists in the digital age. And they had to license them, so that created Texas Instruments, Fairchild Semiconductor, Intel, ComSat, Motorola. Hundreds of companies came out of that, and in fact, entrepreneurs left Bell Labs and set up their own companies to create this kind of explosion of technology. So maybe that's the solution. Maybe we have to force Google to license their autonomous car patents, their advertising patents, their search algorithms, all these things to other companies so we can have some competition. But all I'm saying is, in my book, I put forth a bunch of different solutions. I don't say I have the only answer, but I'm saying we need to have a conversation. Because as long as we think that there's no problem here, then we're putting our head in the sand, and it's just going to get worse, because they're going to get bigger. That's for sure.
All right. So hi, how are you? I'm having quite a visceral reaction to a lot of what you're discussing. I think in part because I am very ingrained in the Bitcoin and blockchain space, and also believe that that is a movement that's trying to, in theory, look like it's democracy, but isn't necessarily, because it's all the same players, right, who are in that space. So I'm curious what your take is on Bitcoin and blockchain in the music space. And then it's a two-part question. And then in addition to that, the SEC just regulated, we talked about crowdfunding before, but they regulated a crowd economy. And so I'm wondering, with regards to the music space, how that might actually play into some of what we've got going on. There's a new website called WeFunder, which is straight, entrepreneurs that are looking to get their businesses funded, and you can actually get equity now, which was never allowed before until about a year ago. So thoughts on that?
It's harder to hear up here than you think. We have no monitors.
Hard to hear up here.
If you can boil that down to a real crisp.
Sure. Bitcoin and blockchain in music.
Okay, I got it. So
That's what we needed.
that's all I needed. I needed those two words. There's some, Craig is probably even more of an expert on this than me because he's been studying
Did two
this.
stories on it, but it's big.
It's a big issue, but look, what's really cool is there are some people really studying this. The guys at the Berklee School of Music are working really hard on this, and as some of you songwriters know, one of the biggest problems is what is known as orphan copyrights. In other words, these companies like Spotify pretend they don't know who owns this piece of music. And so they have sitting in their accounts tens of millions of dollars, which they know they owe to somebody, but they pretend they didn't know who that it is. And so it could be that a really good registry based on blockchain could solve a lot of those problems. And a lot of that money that's just sitting there in their accounts earning interest for them that's not going to the songwriters could find its way to the people. Because the funny thing is, as Jim Griffin and other people point out, it's not hard to find out who those people are that you owe that is. They just don't want to look very hard.
And there might be more of a vending machine approach online to licensing music. Think many more uses that were smaller that would add up to an enormous pie, but you have to have that automation, which means you have to have the good data and a system to do it. Tom, do we have time for one more?
One more.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Juliana, and I'm 18, and I go to Belmont, so I'm kind of getting my feet wet in the industry right now. And one of the things that I was looking at was you were talking about the timeline of how you produced The Last Waltz and how it was so short, and how some of the best clips of the movie or things that make it special are those little nuances that happen when you don't have so many options. And coming from a generation where there are so many options with DAW and like whatever you're going to work with to create your art, do you think that that actually hinders, the final product of what you're making because you have too many options?
Did you catch that one? So and I was going to ask a related question, which was, so she was talking about now that we have digital, we have so many options for camera angles, for effects, for editing, and you all were working in this super tight time frame, and you were working without one of these, and you had a clipboard and pencils and papers and telephones. What's the difference?
I think anybody who's been in a recording studio that has auto-tune and all sorts of ways to fix things knows that it may be that the way that T-Bone records, which is pretty much live, is really more real, and Marty Scorsese thinks that half the problem is that people have too many options. If with modern digital editing tools you can try it 20 different ways, then you probably will try it 20 different ways. And that is a problem. But there's a bigger issue about this that I worry about, which is that finding stuff that you don't know about in terms of what's the role of the curator. We were at a radio station this afternoon, and a guy who's obviously deeply embedded in being a curator. So the problem in the music business today is 20 years ago, we had what was called the 80-20 rule, which is that a record company would make 80% of its profits off of 20% of its product. That is, 1 in 5 records would be a huge hit. Today, 80% of the revenue comes from 1% of the product. So that means that Taylor Swift and Adele and Jay-Z and Beyonce are doing really well, but there are no middle-class musicians. There's no people just making a decent living. The people you're going to see up here in a minute or two were middle-class musicians. They were not as big as the Rolling Stones or Cream, but they made a decent living. And that's what we all ought to have the possibility of a decent living. And since this is the last question, I just want to say one thing. You're going to have a special treat tonight because this sound mix of this movie that you're going to hear was built especially for an event like this by Rob Fraboni, who was the engineer on the record. And it's pretty awesome. I mean, you're going to have a really special opportunity here.
Move fast and break things, how Facebook, Google, and Amazon cornered culture and undermined democracy, out this week. Jonathan Taplin, thank you very much for your time. Keep fighting the good fight. Thank you all. Let's watch a great movie, okay?